start. Okay, good evening and welcome to our second literature debate session. Our literature debates is co-organized by Global Academy and Panorama, and we are today hosting Dimitar Bechev and Ebru Canan-Sokullu to engage in a discussion on Turkey's Western connection and democracy. To start with, I would like to draw attention to the format of our literature review debates. In these debates, we are actually taking a recent publication and continuing with a contemporary debate to discuss a given international phenomenon, departing from this publication. And today our discussion departs from Dimitar Bechev's recent book entitled Turkey under Erdogan, which has been published by a prestigious publisher, Yale University Press. And we believe that this book is well positioned to discuss multiple dimensions of Turkey's Western connections and democracy. And to start with, I will offer a brief summary of the book, its content and coverage. Then I will proceed with questions to the author, offering transition between the author, Dimitar, and discussant Ebru Canan-Sokullu, who has also published a similar book on that, edited similar book regarding the AKP period. I had the honor of reading this book, which is very comprehensive account of Turkish domestic and foreign policy to a broader extent, actually. It is covering the Erdogan period, but it is giving a lot of dependencies, critical junctions from history, focusing extensively on the post-Cold War period, but also the previous period, Crook's period. So it is a very comprehensive account of Turkish domestic and foreign policy, actually. And it has a focus on the term AKP period since 2002. And the book is in general underlining how a country transition from the main pillar of Western alliance and to embark on an interventionist foreign policy and departed from the Western connection. So, this is the content that I would like to open up for discussion. Before I open up to a wider discussion, now I would like to give the floor to Dimitar to reflect on the main findings and defining features of his book and what you covered extensively. What is your reference to domestic and foreign policy of Turkey that you think that Turkey departed from the Western alliance? So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rahime Hocam, and thanks to everyone for hosting me. I feel humbled in the company of so many knowledgeable experts on Turkish politics, both foreign policy and domestic affairs. This book is generally written for a very different audience. I guess the typical reader should be somebody in the West who follows current affairs and is probably interested in Turkey, but not really deep into the debates and the issues we've been grappling with for a couple of decades now. So that's by way of prefacing. And it's difficult to summarize everything because, as you said, this is a descriptive account which, of course, zooms in on the Erdogan era since the AKP came to power in late 2002. But really, the first two chapters deal with the prehistory, as it were. In fact, the book departs somewhere in the mid-80s with a lengthy discussion about Turgut Özal. So I think he deserves the mention as well. And if you put him on the cover, that would have done justice to the book too. But what I really want to underline is this is not a biography of Erdogan. It's a way to reflect on the country as a whole and, of course, its connection to the outside world, both with the West, but also Turkey's neighborhood. That's something Mustafa Hoca and myself and others have engaged in heated debates all over the years. And the story starts at the time of reform after the 1980 coup with Özal coming to the fore. There are several themes, narrative threads, if you will, in the book. One is the ups and downs of Turkish democratization, which we'll be talking about in this conversation. And the overarching question is what went wrong in Turkey. Why is it that Turkey, which had a messy democracy in the 90s and the 2000s, but democracy nonetheless transitioned into a regime which scholars in the field describe variously, but I think the term that has been accepted is this competitive authoritarian system. What brought us where we are, and also what are the prospects for this system going forward. Since this is a descriptive book, I don't have a definitive answer. I don't need to do what political scientists do and single out one factor that explains everything. And I'm highlighting a number of things, both related to the actors involved, starting from Erdogan, but also others in Turkish political life, as well as structures, long-term trends to do with the type of state formation in Turkey, nationalism, the persistence of various cleavages, ethnic, social, and so on and so forth, and also the institutional weakness, the whole discussion about checks and balances, and not least the ambiguous role played by the outside. As we know from the democratization literature, the outside can play this anchoring role, especially given the huge debate we have about the EU in its neighborhoods, how it conditioned reforms in a number of regions and countries on the periphery of the EU. But also, as the book shows, and that's something I'm sure we'll be going back to in the hour ahead of us, how the EU contributed also to de-democratization in Turkey. So that's one of the themes I'm exploring. The second theme, as you mentioned, is Turkish foreign policy, both continuities. In many respects, we see some themes from the 1990s right now coming back to the fore, but also changes in the new Turkey Erdogan built in his image. The ambitions for Turkey to not just be an ally or pillar of the West or periphery of the West, but to be a center of its own world, didn't start with the AKP. We can trace it back to the Özal era again. The means of realizing it, though, were different. What Turkey failed to achieve in the immediate post-Cold War world became much more pressing in the world that we saw developing with the withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East in the late 2000s with the Arab Spring and so on and so forth. So Turkish foreign policy, which is much more, how shall I put it, confident, much more interventionist, if you will, is a departure from the overall posture Turkey had in its region, but also what I want to highlight in the book are the threads running decades back. And that's a very brief summary of the arguments in the book. And of course, the epilogue looks forward to what we can expect. I think the current system is quite resilient. So unlike many people in Turkey who think that the next year will be a turning point, I'm withdrawing judgment. I don't know, because there's so much at stake. But when it comes to democratic development, I don't think Turkey will remain in this place where it is. Longer term, it will probably go back to the kind of regime we're accustomed to because of democratic resilience, long experience with democratic elections, relatively mature civil society, multi-party politics, X number of factors. So what we saw in Istanbul and Ankara in 2019 is symptomatic. So that's one conclusion. The other conclusion is that Turkey in foreign policy will remain sort of activist, maybe not prone to military interventions anymore, but it will try to continue shaping its immediate environment the way it has. But in order to, and that's my final thought, in order to be successful in this quest, I think democracy and domestic consolidation, the success of the economy as well is a sine qua non. So the the current foreign policy that we saw in Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth might not be sustainable. But a form of Turkish leadership will always be there, I suspect, even beyond Erdogan. So let me stop here and pass it on to Ebru.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive account on the book, which raises quite a number of questions. Now I would like to turn to Ebru Hocam. Ebru Canan-Sokullu has also edited a book recently entitled Turkey in Transition, which also covered AKP era, and it dealt with politics, society, and foreign policy, which was published in 2020, so 2 years before Dimitar's publication. So now I would like to turn to Ebru. Ebru, what are your public reflections on Dimitar's recent contribution, and how do you interpret the findings with regard to Turkey's Western connection as of today?
Thank you very much, Rahime, first of all, for inviting me. It's great to be with you here, and that gave me a great opportunity to read the book. And congratulations, first of all, Dimitar, for the very comprehensive account. Well, I think, as Rahime mentioned, I've recently edited this book on the transition during the AKP era, and that basically is about the last 2 decades of the Turkish politics and the transition also in foreign policy and political culture. But I would if I may, let me go through a couple of points that I think this book makes a great contribution to the studies of democracy, because as the book concerns itself with the democracy during that particular era, and one of the major contributions, I think, is how it links the democratization or the democratic retreat. There are several ways to describe, that democratic decline in the Turkish context with the foreign policy. So I would like to stick with the democracy part, and I would like to give a couple of numbers about the democratic backsliding that Turkey has been going through over the last 2 decades, and probably I will give some accounts, some considerations about a foreign policy context in the second round, if I may. So, well, I think the book starts with a brilliant question as to why Turkey has succumbed to authoritarianism and take to nationalism and turn away from the West. And this is the major arguments that the book is constructed around. And Dimitar has 3 different answers. The first answer is about Erdogan's evolution from an EU-friendly Muslim Democrat to a strong man. And that tells us a lot about, the definition of strong man, and in the context of also the authoritarian populism that is argued extensively in the literature. And the second answer that the book gives is about the Western allies who contributed to this backsliding, right? The EU and the United States, and I quote Dimitar here, contributed to the empowerment of Erdogan so much he turned his back to the West. This is my interpretation. And the third answer is embedded in the long-term structural and institutional forces shaping Turkey's democratic politics and foreign policy. And there is an extensive discussion, as Dimitar pointed out, going back to Özal era, as far as a top-down democratization has been designed, starting even earlier. This has been always a top-down project. So I think these 3 answers needs a very elaborate discussion, but maybe in the Q&A session. So the book whirls mostly about around the 3 factors, 3 variables, 3 independent variables, if I may put correctly, as to Turkey's illiberal trajectory and democratic could best be understood by. So it is linked with the polarized society, it is linked with the undemocratic institutional arrangement and exclusionary nationalism. So, as I told you, there are a couple of striking numbers as far as Turkey's democracy in its own context needs to be discussed. The first one, well, we all know all these data sources, but I strongly recommend to the all our friends here to go through some numbers described in the Varieties of Democracy project, VDEM project. And there, one of the striking problems regarding Turkey's democracy, liberal democracy, is actually the liberal democracy index plummeted 35% points between 2008 and 2018. So in terms of the liberal democracy index, this is like a very high, almost 2/3 of the entire story about democracy is under a great, serious problem. So what needs to be maybe more, maybe not in this project, but what needs to be remembered as far as the democratic decline is concerned, and Dimitar also, describes this as an important variable in terms of the structural determinants of the problems related to democracy, can be listed as, in a greater list of variables. We may look at the party system, the electoral threshold, personalized party politics for sure, the electoral volatility, political culture, definitely an indispensable determinant of the entire story of democracy in Turkey, let alone all the other variables. And a traditional, very weak civil society, military, the tradition of the tutelary democracy, maybe we can put here. So there is like a very long list of, variables, factors that we need to maybe consider. But I mean, of course, this book doesn't need to go through that. But over over the entire history of the republic, and democracy, these have played significant role in why Turkey has suffered from all these issues related to democracy, and why it was actually possible during the last 2 decades that Turkey went into a sharp retreat in democracy, in the democracy indices. So there are several ways actually to describe Turkey's democracy, and I think starting with the Özal period, we can still apply these concepts relate or classifications of democracy, from delegative democracy to tutelary democracy. Some colleagues like Berk and Şebnem work on the electoral authoritarianism, electoral autocracy. So there are several ways, actually, categories that we can think of the Turkish democracy on its own account as a democratic decline, that's for sure. And there is like a sharper decline in the last couple of years due to the change in the system. So, and we should definitely think about the polarization issue, because over the past 18 years, President Erdogan has contested successfully 15 elections, including referenda. And for his supporters, he has become a symbol of national pride, a powerful, internationally admired leader, a modern advocate of Muslim values, and of course, strong leadership when it comes to the foreign policy. So I think this tells us a lot about the polarization as far as what the other bloc thinks of Erdogan as a leader and his successive government. So this is something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And Özal period, I would bring it back to, of course, the scholars in our literature brings it back to the very birth of the Republic. But I think very carefully and in a very analytical way, the book gives a detailed account on starting with the Özal period. So that tells us a lot about the political traditions. Maybe for a future discussion in the Q&A session, and also maybe I would like to hear Dimitar's opinions on the categorizations, or giving references to more the debates on what type of democracy this could be, depending on, I don't know, Bob Dawes or Linton Steffen's categorization, Przeworski, or Engelhardt and Belsa. So these are the scholars which actually, based on data analysis, gives us a comparative account as to the democracies in different parts of the country. So, I'm not going to go into the entire literature, of course, but going back to the VDEM, data, well, Turkey has never been a participatory, liberal, egalitarian, or a deliberative democracy. So that we need to keep this in our analysis of the last 2 decades. So arguing that it was a liberal democracy and now things got worse over the 2 decades would be, I think, quite unfair. But of course, we need to understand why there was even a sharper decline in the tutelary democracy, for instance, or a delegative democracy, like our colleagues in different institutions in Turkey put Turkey in. So that's why I think, rather than going into what type of democracy Turkey is, as this book also puts, and as other studies in the literature also put, Turkey has suffered a sharp decline in different indices, like in different indicators of democracy, like rule of law, freedoms, civic engagement, or the indices about clientelism or patronage. These are all the indicators of democraticness of a country. What is extremely visible that the data tells us is that there is this sharper decline over not the entire 2 decades of the AKP government, but let me put like after 2014. And there are, I'm not going to take it too long. I will just remind before moving on to the second session. One needs to go through the transformation of civil-military relations, which had not been a linear transformation during the AKP period. We actually have 4 sub-periods, so that to understand better, more objectively, the AKP period, we need to cut it into maybe 4 halves, right? And this also links with the relationship between the West and Turkey. Like the 2002 to 2005, and then 2005 to maybe the Ergenekon trials, and then maybe the 4th period after the change in the system to presidentialism. So we need sub-terms to better analyze the retreat in the Turkish democracy. I'm not going to go into too much discussion on the authoritarian populism, but this also coincides with this 4-term analysis. Maybe, I mean, there are experts, iTouch is, Elchi, these are all analyzing with data, the rise of the populism and how it actually had a counterproductive impact on the democratization. I'm not an economist, so I can't make big judgments about the developmental issues, the developmental populist discourse, but it definitely needs to be, to take into account the economic crisis, maybe both the national economic crisis and the global economic crisis, and so that to some. Whatever category you put, or with whichever type of data we analyze the Turkish democracy over the last 2 decades during the AKP period, we definitely need to have a more detailed and concentrated account into different time periods. That's for sure. Well, I stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ebru Hocam. I think we have quite a comprehensive account of Turkish domestic and foreign policy and different democracy types. And, when I'm reading a book by Dimitar, I was so impressed about some of the things, like the data, primary data that he relied on, especially one statement from I saw it in the Planning and Budgetary Committee proceedings. And I have it everywhere, actually, but I have never been able to use it in the way that Dimitar actually used it. I think this is what expertise pays off. And the statement is this: Turkey is a European country, an Asian country, a Middle Eastern country, Balkan country, Caucasian country, neighbor to Africa, Black Sea country, Caspian Sea, all of these. Okay, this is a very popular statement for me. Like, I use it everywhere. Now I would like to, bring this into discussion, and I would like to ask, to what extent is there the West to blame? Ebru has also reflected on this a little bit, but I would like to turn to Ebru on her public opinion studies later. Now I would like to invite you, Dimitar, to to reflect on it, in your framing, do you think Western leaders share some blame on how Turkey has turned out, in your own words? Do you think the EU could have sustained Turkish democratic connection better? So the floor is yours.
I'm afraid I don't have the definitive answer to this one. And very often with those polarized debates, what I do in the book, and maybe it's a cop-out, is just to give the reader arguments for and against. Certainly, if you want to argue the case of Western guilt, you want to look at what happened in 2007, because for me, that's the turning point. In 2007, when Nicolas Sarkozy won the French elections, and that's very topical given yesterday's outcome, that was a clear sign to Erdogan, but also to the Turkish political elite writ large, that accession is not coming, was not coming. Because Sarkozy changed the whole discourse, even at the kind of institutional level, there were changes in the sense that some chapters were kept off limits because they kind of preconditioned full membership as opposed to privileged partnership. So if you want to look at that, you'd say, yeah, that was a turning point. And after 2007, even if AKP and Erdogan had the best intentions, that changed the incentive structures and from on, they concluded that it's much better to concentrate power rather than continue on the democratization path. The counter argument, I think, is that ultimately Turkish fate, but the fate of Turkey is in the hands of domestic actors. The EU or anybody else can contribute to some dynamics, can lock in some dynamics, but Turkey is a big place, and the decision makers are the voters, Turkish society, and political elites, and that's mediated to Turkish institutions. So it's not that somebody in Brussels, Paris, or Washington decided that Turkey should be the way it is. You're giving too much credit to the outside world. So that's probably the other narrative. I think going back to the story, maybe there's a way to bridge those two arguments. And I don't have to, again, pass a judgment because it's a historical book, it's a descriptive book, it's not work of political science, in all honesty. And the story will be something along the lines that, I mean, the EU was important because in the early days of the AKP, it made possible a vast coalition. So it was not just the traditional Islamist voters, conservatives supporting Erdogan. He could broaden the appeal to other groups, sort of pro-Western liberals, left-leaning people could see Erdogan as the key to making Turkey much more open, pluralistic, and facing all the historical issues, for instance, the Kurdish challenge. But also other social groups, business, which was heavily internationalized, could see AKP because of its domestic economic policy, but also EU as the preferable option to the opposition, which was very much entrenched into nationalism. And even some Kurdish nationalists could give begrudging support to the AKP because that was a party recognizing some of their demands, at least rhetorically, if not doing much on substance. So without the EU, this coalition would have been difficult to sustain. And the moment the EU pulled the plug, the coalition collapsed. But again, this was not just because the EU pulled the plug. There were other things at play. Again, going back to the Kurdish issue, the ultimate divorce didn't happen in 2007. It didn't happen even during Gezi Park. It happened 2 years later because of domestic processes, and partly because of what was going on in Syria. So yeah, I mean, the West is an important part of the story, and it's in my title. But I guess it's a contributing factor whether you believe the EU was the good guy or you believe that the EU was a bad guy. But that's something else I want to also say is that very often people have these binary ideas that you either with the West or you left the West. And I think when the publisher said turned from the West as a suggestion for a title, I thought that was a good idea because turning doesn't mean decoupling. If you look again, the figures about connectivity, trading relations, sort of migration patterns. I mean, you have countries in Western Europe with people of Turkish origin as ministers. I mean, you have the new Dutch government, you have General Özdemir in Germany. You understand how deeply embedded this relationship is. And even if ideologically, rhetorically, in terms of worldview, Turkish elites might be drifting from the West, there's some underlying societal and economic factors, at least between Turkey and the EU, that sustain the relationship. Whether this can be a factor for democratization in the future or a neutral, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a fixed opinion on this one. It's just important to acknowledge, and lots of people, at least in the think tank community or the journalistic communities, think in terms of headlines. So when Erdogan was doing reforms 2002, 2005, he was the exemplary Democrat, and now overlooking the blind spots in the policies. But equally now, I think people believe that it's all over with the EU, whereas I think empirical evidence shows that it isn't. And Turkey, for intents and purposes, is part of this marketplace, even if normatively it's drifted in a different direction.
Thank you very much. So what actually encourages this multiple identity definitions for Turkey? How do you interpret, Turkey's position of like using its identity as European, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Caucasian, African? Can you reflect on this a little bit?
It's a big debate, and I think it's worth a couple of more books, and indeed people have written extensively. Those people who are much more proficient than I am. But look, I mean, the basic facts: Turkey is a big place, right? It has large population. It's the heir of a vast empire, and in Turkey you have people who have all kinds of origins, biographically, several generations back. As a result, their connections to various countries in the neighborhood. There is the Western connection, but as we discovered during the Syrian war, when it brought back home the message that was very clear to local communities that this border is very recent and cuts across various communities, be it Turks, Kurds, Arabs, and so on and so forth. And so there's this connection, obviously, it's been deepened because of the refugees coming to Turkey. There is a clear connection to the post-Soviet space. Now we have another war north of Turkey. Because of history, because of Turkish size, because of its geography. I mean, some parts of Western Turkey are closer to places in Central Europe than to cities in the east of Turkey. This multi-vector, multi-connectivity is an inevitable fact. What the old Turkey constructed was a very monolithic identity, and that's actually something that is good about the 2000s, that has stayed with us despite all changes. The recognition that Turkish society is diverse in terms of ethnic origins, but also connections to neighboring regions. And this multiple connections, these multiple connections are not a burden, but a source of wealth for Turkey. So that's my kind of very vague answer to your question. I don't see any contradiction that Turkey can be part of multiple other neighborhoods around these borders. It's just maybe a matter of discussion what it does with those connections, whether Turkey has the capacity to shape regional order. AKP in its early iteration was very upbeat, I mean, very self-confident. And the war in Syria kind of brought back home how difficult it is to interfere in other countries' business. That is linked to risks. There's a cost to pay. There's no guarantee you'll be successful in shaping regional order. So some of the old elites, the Kemalists, if you will, that were very anti-interventionists and thought that Turkish foreign policy has to be about sort of defending the homeland, stood vindicated because they never believed that military intervention is a good idea. And their ideas, because of Syria, gained some relevance, even if they lost the historical battle against the AKP in Iran, sort of emerged victorious from this domestic contestation.
Thank you very much, Dimitar, for these reflections. Now I would like to pick up from the one previous argument about the role of Western powers, and I would like to turn to Ebru, because she has published extensively on European public and elite opinion and the viewpoints of the mass and elite opinion in Europe, focusing particularly on the impact of Islamophobia and fears of immigrants, and more general about Turkish skepticism. Building on this research, how the mass and elite opinion in Europe shaped Turkey's Western connection and democracy, what are your findings and what can you tell us about whether Turkey's Western connection could be restored in the future? If so, how? So can you please tell us a little bit about that, Ebru?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, let me start with understanding first what the Turkish people think about democracy, because this is, I think, an integral part of all sorts of democracies, all sorts of democratic process. Without understanding what the people and the elite think, we can't really, I mean, this is of course one argument in the entire literature. There are scholars who completely disagree with this, but I come from the first school, right? Vox Populi matters. And this is exactly true for Turkey and for Europe. Now, I think I should start with one of the conclusions that Dimitar talks about in the book. He says, Turkey in 20 years will still be Erdogan's Turkey. And then he continues, right? Even without him, Erdoganism will live on. Think of Peronism, Gaullism, and any number of isms in countries far and near. So I definitely agree with this argument, because I believe that the political culture will not change dramatically. And what matters for democracies and democratizations and the relationship between democracies or non-democratic countries depend very much on what people perceive and what people prefer. So going back to the Turkish story of democracy and how the Turkish people figure out what type of a regime is that, or, you know, if it is preferable to an army rule or a rule of the, you know, experts, technocrats, or strong leaders. Well, looking at there are different surveys, and the World Values Survey has an extensive, you know, battery of questions on understanding the culture of democracy. So, and there are a couple of questions, like I will just give you, you know, a very brief account. When you ask the Turks since 1994, you know, what type of political system they prefer, they always prefer democratic political system over all sorts of alternatives, even though comparatively, you know, the figures are lower than the public opinion in consolidated or liberal democracy. So I think this is a very good indicator. Okay, and of course, going back to Dimitar's conclusion, this can be a little bit concerning indicator as to what people's preferences or how people's preferences will not change dramatically, and it will take time, right? So coming back to your question, and I will start with another conclusion that Dimitar in his book points out. He says, what is also changing, what is also not changing is Turkey's love and hate relationship with the West. And I wholeheartedly agree with his points. His evidence is in the book, but I think we need to read the question from a different perspective. That is, what about EU's love and hate relationship with Turkey? And here comes back to Rahime, your questions. What do the Europeans think of us? Well, of course, there's like a huge literature on how to define, how not to define the Europeans, European public opinion. I'm not going to go into all these debates, but let me speak of some data again. I mean, I love speaking of with data, and when it comes to public and elite opinion, I always use them. So, in slightly earlier study that we carried out with Çiğdem Kentmen-Çin, on a longitudinal analysis of the European attitudes towards Turkey, and it was a comparative study. It covered, like, since the 1973, what the Europeans thought of Turkey, Turkey's democracy, Turkey's EU membership, so forth and so on. And of course, as far as data led us, right, there are a couple of generic observations about what the Europeans think of Turkey. Well, the attitudes towards Turkey has overall been always very skeptical, right? I mean, I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers. The Eurobarometers are there, and they measure since 1973 what, different European countries think of Turkey in different rounds. But since the 1970s, Turkey-EU relations and Turkey's membership, which is also very much linked to Turkey's democratization, has showed us one thing, that there has been a negative opinion in the EU, in the EC earlier, right? And there are, of course, some Turkey skeptic countries as well as the Turkophiles. So there are all these variations across the EU countries. But let me go through with some specific, incidents. If they made a difference in the way that the Europeans thought about Turkey. For instance, in 2005, right after the 2004 enlargement, when the European Council decided to open the membership talks with Turkey, a great majority of Europeans opposed Turkey's membership. And it was like nearly 36% of the Europeans who supported Turkey's accession. And that was in the immediate post 2004 enlargement. So that was a completely different climate. But I think, over time, things got even worse for Turkey, right? In the minds of the European electorate. So you may ask, like, why should it matter? Because, European consensus versus the census on Turkey's much debated accession process might have dramatic impacts on the enlargement. And considering that Turkey's democratization has been long anchored in its relations with the West, I think we need to pay a greater attention to understanding the European electorate. Some call it public opinion, some call it electorate. But at times of elections, look what happens in France, what happened with Viktor Orban in Hungary. I mean, we can just expand these examples, and we can find the answers as to why it matters for Turkey's democratization, right? So, and as you put, there are different explanations on, if there can be some sort of positive or a negative impact on understanding Turkey's EU membership or Turkey's anchor in West. We can look at the social identities. We can look at the rational choice theories. A couple of years ago, we had done another research with Çiğdem, and there we found, Europeans are not very much concerned about if Turkey is like a super costly project for EU, but they're more concerned about Turkey's level of democratization, if Turkey shares similar cultural norms, so forth and so on. So social identity and values matter much more when it comes the evaluation of Turkey in the minds of the people. What about in the minds of the elite? As half of the question was about the European elite. So in 2006 and 2007, with the European Elite Opinion Survey with German Marshall Fund. And to my knowledge, I mean, we were discussing with Rahime today, like if it is an outdated, data or not. I think it can be old, but it actually gives us a very important thing. Look, When we did this research on the European elite in 2006 and 7, we interviewed with the officers from the Commission, Council, and the Parliament, the parliamentarians. So we had like 250 parliamentarians that we interviewed. And what we discovered is that the Euro parliamentarians share more or less the same concerns as to the public. That's okay, that's very understandable. And so since then, of course, the configuration of the European Parliament changed. Turkish skepticism increased much higher because even like the populist parties entered, and so the European populism, the liberals, they actually have take a footage, like a larger footage. So, well, what does this tell us in terms of like, so what question, right? I mean, Turkey, if Turkey's European Union's relations with Turkey is a love and hate relation, I think looking at the Euro parliamentarians and their negative attitudes towards Turkey tells us a lot, because they play a more significant role in the European enlargement, in the grand design of the European politics towards candidate countries, so forth and so on. Well, the commissioners and the council officials, they're much more like, promising, because they approach to the Turkish issue, Turkey's democracy, Turkish politics from a more technocratic view with more, quality information. So what does this tell us? Years ago, Oloren was the commissioner for, responsible from enlargement, and he had stated in one of the meetings that Turkey's relationship with the West and enlargement with the EU depends very much on if the Turks and the Europeans really believe that it's a good thing. So you need to convince the people. And well, going back to the question that, that argument that Dimitar posed in the beginning, like it will take 2 decades, at least 2 decades, to convince the Turks that while Europeanization or like democratization, these values are good things, and we need a longer term perspective to once again convince the electorate that, we need democracy. Even if it was like the COVID period that we went through, and there was like this global transition to more authoritarian regimes, we need to go back to the good old days where we believe that democracy should be the anchor. And this, I think, gives, and I'll stop here, this gives like maybe more questions. This leaves us with more questions than with the answers that also Dimitar, poses in his book. And maybe we can also think more like if global shocks, not only Turkey, but global shocks will actually change our understanding of democracy and the need in the minds and the hearts of the ordinary people, the need for democracy, if it is really an essential need or not. And this will all bring us to more existential questions, and we will think more about the specific case of Turkey, I suppose. But I think that's all.
Thank you very much, Ebru. I think we have learned a lot about the domestic, international, EU-related, public opinion-related factors that drive Turkey's Western connection back and forth. I have some questions in the chat, which partly Dimitar answered, so I will turn to them later. Before I turn to them, I would like to ask Dimitar again one question about departing from some of the analysis that he posted in the book. He argued that Turkish foreign policy adopted a military stance under Erdogan and intervened in regional conflicts, such as Nagorno-Karabakh and Libya. And I'm wondering how Turkey's position is different from 1990s. And related to this, I see that in your book, you are framing Turkey's such intervention strategy as an illustration of its departure from Western alliance. So can you please elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big debate, of course. I think the question is, were in the 1990s, what would have been different in terms of Turkish responses to those questions. And in some ways it's easy because Nagorno-Karabakh happened in two phases. In the early phase, which sort of culminated in the period between 1988 and 1993, Turkey was first constrained by the Cold War, but in the later stages it wasn't. But it didn't send military assistance to the Azeris, who were struggling at the time because of, first of all, it had to be a multilateral approach. Secondly, it was seen as still Russia's turf. The risks of direct intervention outweighed the potential benefits, and also the national security culture was non-interventionist at the time, despite all kinds of forces pushing Turkey for intervention. The same was true of Bosnia at the time. The same was even more true about the First Chechen War, where you had a clear division between the government at the time when Tansu Çiller was in charge versus the military, which was much more reticent. So it's a clear difference. In the 90s, Libya would have been possible because it's too far away from Turkey's border, and you couldn't make an argument that the vital interest is at stake. And by contrast, some form of Syria probably was possible. I mean, because actually using military force beyond Turkey's border is the legacy of the Kurdish issue. But there's an interesting twist with AKP foreign policy. In the early stages of the Syria war, it was about regime change and about the activist idea to reshape regional order. But in 2016, when we actually had military intervention, it was framed as a defensive move. So there was a reference to the old Turkey, as it were. You're defending Turkey because of the danger of separatism. So some bits of this interventionist culture are pretty novel, but some other aspects have clear resonance with what was going on before the AKP. Now, of course, as we speak, there is a new operation in northern Iraq against the PKK, and that's going back to the peak of the war in the southeast, which happened after Özal's death and before the Öcalan's capture in 1999. So some of what we see chimes in has resemblances or echoes to the 1990s, but other bits of the policy are pretty novel. The fact that you could think of Turkey as a kingmaker in Libya, I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams would conceive that. And the fact that you at some point think that you could shape Egypt and its your image or topple Bashar al-Assad, that was unthinkable. Also at the level of discourse, you see major departure. I mean, certainly Turkey in the old days thought that Islam was part of its identity, but was very measured how, to what extent it portrayed itself as a Muslim power specifically. Whereas for Erdogan, it's a no-brainer that he has a mission to be the leader of at least Sunni Muslims, and he always plays this card. Maybe it's not opportunistic, it's also a matter of deep belief. And one clear moment, at least for me, was in 2018 when he went to Sarajevo and planted the flag saying that Turkey is the natural leader of Muslims in Europe. So those rhetorical moves would have been unthinkable in the old Turkey, even if you see some continuities in the idea that you can defend your national sovereignty beyond your borders in the neighboring countries, in the immediate neighborhood, which starts with the first Gulf War and the changes in northern Iraq. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but yeah, again, I think the headline is the Turkish foreign policy is continuity, but also quite dramatic changes in substance and in style.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. In the meantime, I can invite the audience to reflect and ask their questions if they have any questions. Funada had a question, but you partially answered that question. But like she was asking about, is the current track of democracy in Turkey caused by an existing issue in the political system, or was it caused mostly by external factors and contextual changes? If the changes caused by the mix of factors, what are the most influential ones? So she actually she said she is curious about the hardware issues in the AKP party itself, or the Turkish political system might have led to this reduction in democracy.
Yeah, my intellectual disposition is that democracy is a home business, it's domestic. I mean, you could point at critical junctures in Turkish history when the external factor tipped the balance. I mean, one would be 1946, the introduction of multi-party politics. It's clearly correlated to the Cold War and Turkey's desire to become part of the new West Africa shaping in pursuit of security. But again, I mean, think about the 1990s, when the trend across the world was towards democratization. People spoke about the lost decade. Turkey followed a very different trajectory, at least for the first 10 years. It was not until 97 that it started to implement some more far-reaching reforms in response to EU conditionality. I think the main takeaway for me is that democracy is driven from the bottom up. You have to have local players interested in promoting democratic governance, or at least some critical mass in society. And then the external factor can tip the balance, especially when you've reached a tipping point. But without the domestic preconditions, it's a fool's errand to promote democracy from outside. The fact that in Turkey, EU conditionality was at least successful initially had to do a lot with the fact that you had a broad spectrum of support for such reforms. I mean, for instance, civil-military relations. The EU could help there because Turkish political opinion had reached a point where actually, because especially after 97, the last London school, that the role of the military is to protect externally Turkey, but not to be arbiter in domestic politics. And that was not just the conservatives who shared this opinion, it was more broadly dispersed. And you saw that in 2013, Gezi, where there was no demand like 2007 for the military to intervene. You saw it in the response to 2016, the failed coup, where actually all the parties condemned the coup. So it's not that the EU told Turkey that military intervention was something bad. It was Turkish society coming to the conclusion that civilian politics is the way forward. And you can think of many countless examples. So yeah, I mean, democracy works from within. You cannot. But having said that, like, external factors matter a lot because they could direct the process, can help build some external momentum, and they could make things worse if it were. I remember the sort of policy debates we kept having around 2010, 2011. Then the spirit was, okay, the EU abandoned Turkey, but Turkey developed so much domestic momentum for democracies, so the EU doesn't need, Turkey doesn't need the EU anymore, right? There is such a broad support for democratization. The EU was there at the beginning to provide the initial push, and once that's done, we can handle it on our own. It turned out that was not the case. But yeah, in the book I make the parallel with Hungary. suppose that the EU was still involved in Turkey and even had Turkey as a member state, I don't think chances were, and that's very speculative, that Turkey would become the exemplary democracy and characterized by the rule of law. A Hungarian scenario, a strongman ahead of a EU member state, is just as likely. So that's a hopeful message, because it means that it's within the power of Turks themselves, Turkish citizens, to push the country one way or another. So it's the ballot box, if you will. And maybe just to backtrack a little bit to this question about qualifiers, I think the best thing to describe Turkey in the old days was electoral democracy, because all things being equal, the opposition had a chance to come to power. So elections did matter. Do they matter now? Maybe they do. We'll find out next year. But its minimalist definition is very easy to operationalize. Everything beyond it, with horizontal accountability, with the rule of law, with human rights, it's first of all very difficult bar to clear, threshold. And under the best of circumstances, Turkey will be struggling. But also for us as analysts, as scholars, it's a matter of disagreement. Where is it? What is the point where democracy consolidates? So yeah, I mean, electoral democracy is likely, or minimalist democracy is likely direction that Turkey is heading, and it was already there at some point in the past. So yeah, these are my kind of impromptu reflections on your question.
Thank you very much, Dimitar. These are really excellent reflections, and I actually like the way that you used several counterfactuals in your book, and especially this one about analogy about Viktor Orban, whether Turkey would be similar to Hungary, and you reflected on this, and thanks a lot for this. I think we have 1 hour further already, but I have one question that I still want to ask, if nobody is asking any other questions. I think when you just published your book in this year, and perhaps before you actually submitted your proof, this war in Ukraine wasn't still there. And I've also seen some, comparison in your book between Erdogan and Putin. And I want you to discuss a little bit on that, if you can. We know that Turkey's Western connection never ceases to be a contemporary issue. It will remain there as a contemporary issue 20 years after, I'm sure. But I would like you to tell something, like, how do you see Russia's war in Ukraine in terms of Turkey's alliance and connection with the West? And why does the Turkey lie here?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said about it. Suffice it to say that, I mean, the war is a chance for Turkey to rediscover its place in what a friend of ours, Galip Dalay, has called the strategic West. I mean, Galip made this distinction between the normative West, where Turkey doesn't belong by choice because of political elite, and the strategic West. Now, if Russia shows its willingness to use military force beyond borders, that means that at the end of the day, when the chips are down, NATO is very relevant to Turkey as an insurance policy. And Ebru might correct me there, but I think that's reflected also in surveys, that the average Turk might have all kinds of suspicions and resentments against the United States and the West more generally, but support for NATO has stayed very firm, and that's a reflection of geopolitics. So that's one of the first things to say. The second thing to say is that Turkey, or Erdogan and people around him, have seized the opportunity to actually assert Turkey's role as an intermediary, as a go-between, because they think this is a way to reset relations with the West, but also maybe get some mileage out of Russia. we haven't seen much in terms of concrete outcomes, partly because the situation is not ripe to mediation. Not as long as Russians and Ukrainians think that they could benefit from continued fighting or can win that. But they had obviously incentive to be seen as negotiating, and Turkey also had the benefit of being seen as the intermediary. So that's number two. My third observation is that the longer the war lasts, the worse it gets for Turkey, because the fallout on domestic affairs will be a bit more palpable. The economic consequences won't be great. Think about the tourism sector, the spike in energy prices. That's happening in an election year when, as in any normal country, bread and butter issues to do with bills and money and salaries and so on and so forth is what tops people's agenda. I don't think your neighbor cares about negotiations in Libya and what Turkey does there, or even Karabakh, even if that's a more emotional issue, or Ukraine, but they certainly do care about the cost of living. And so the last thing the incumbent that said one wants is further deterioration in the economic situation. And I'm afraid that the longer the war lasts, the more conspicuous the economic consequences will become. So Turkey is also vulnerable to the situation. It's not only a matter of a geopolitical opportunity that now it's time for Turkey to cash in on.
All right, thank you very much, Dimitar. I think, thank you very much, both Dimitar and Ebru Hocam. We have, I think, had extensive debate, and it was very fruitful for me. Reading the book alone, after reading Ebru Hocam's book 2 years before, I think it was excellent. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and honoring us with your extensive knowledge and expertise on Turkish domestic and foreign policy. And yeah, thanks a lot. And if you want to stay, please.
It's a real pleasure for me.
Thank you very much, Dimitar. It has been a real pleasure again, to read your book. And I'm looking forward to read the second edition in 20 years and to see if your provisions will come true. Thank you very much. There is always room for improvement, of course, and we have a lot of questions that, more questions than answers. This is the academic destiny. And I'm looking forward to reading your future analysis. Thank you very much. This is a great contribution.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.